Tonight, we are going to spend some quiet, unhurried time with a story that has existed for centuries, passed gently from one generation to the next in Japan, often without ceremony and without urgency. It is the kind of story that was never meant to demand attention or to be performed for an audience. Instead, it was something that lived alongside everyday life, mentioned softly during long evenings, remembered during certain seasons, and sometimes left unspoken altogether. This is not a story that asks you to stay alert or to follow closely. You don't need to keep track of details, and you don't need to remember names or places. You can listen as much or as little as you like, letting the sound of the words remain in the background, steady and predictable, while your thoughts slow down. The story we're exploring belongs to a time when life moved at a very different pace, when the natural world shaped daily routines in ways that are easy to forget now. In those days, weather was not a minor inconvenience or a passing topic of conversation. It determined when people traveled, when they worked, when they rested, and when they stayed indoors. Seasons were not simply markers on a calendar. They were lived experiences, each with its own rhythms, challenges, and quiet moments. People paid close attention to their surroundings because they had to, and over time, those observations became stories. Many of these stories were not created with the intention of explaining everything clearly. They didn't offer neat conclusions or definitive answers. Instead, they provided a way to speak about uncertainty, about danger, and about forces that could not be controlled. When something happened without an obvious cause, or when the environment felt unpredictable, stories helped give shape to those experiences. They made them easier to talk about, easier to remember, and sometimes easier to accept. Tonight's story centers around a figure known as Yuki-onna, often translated as the Snow Woman. Even her name carries a sense of distance and simplicity, offering just enough description to suggest an image without fully defining what that image should be. Depending on where the story was told and who was telling it, the details changed slightly. In some places, she was spoken of carefully, almost indirectly. In others, she appeared more clearly in seasonal stories shared during certain times of year. There was never a single version that everyone agreed on, and that lack of certainty was part of what allowed the story to endure. Rather than thinking of this as one specific legend with a fixed beginning and end, it can be more helpful to think of it as a collection of related ideas that developed slowly over time. Ideas about nature, about isolation, and about the quiet risks that accompanied everyday life. These ideas weren't presented dramatically. They were woven into ordinary moments, often mentioned in passing, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a reminder, and sometimes simply as something that people accepted as part of the world they lived in. As we move through this story, we won't rush. There's no destination we're trying to reach quickly, and no message you're expected to uncover. Instead, we'll spend time with the atmosphere in which this story existed, with the conditions that allowed it to take shape, and with the way people once experienced the world around them. We'll talk about the legend itself, but we'll also linger on the quieter details. The environment, the routines, and the moments when stories like this felt most natural to share. It's worth remembering that for much of history, storytelling was not a form of entertainment in the way we think of it today. Stories were not something separate from daily life. They were part of how people made sense of what they saw and experienced, especially when explanations were difficult to find. When travel was dangerous, stories reflected that danger. When illness appeared suddenly, stories gave it a shape. And when nature felt unpredictable, stories helped make it feel familiar, even if it remained uncontrollable. These stories were often shared without emphasis. There was no expectation that they would be remembered perfectly or repeated exactly the same way each time. What mattered was that they continued to exist, changing slightly as they moved from one person to another. Over time, certain images, themes, and patterns remained, while others faded away. This gradual process is what gave folklore its quiet resilience. As you listen tonight, you don't need to decide whether this story should be taken literally, symbolically, or simply as something people once believed. You don't need to place it into a specific category or evaluate it in any particular way. You can let it exist as it is, as a reflection of how people once interacted with their environment and with each other. The story doesn't demand interpretation, and it doesn't insist on meaning. It simply unfolds. Throughout this video, we'll take a slow, steady approach, allowing the narration to move at a pace that feels comfortable and predictable. There will be moments when ideas repeat themselves in slightly different ways, and that's intentional. Repetition was part of how these stories were remembered, and it's also part of what makes them easy to listen to without effort. If your attention drifts, that's fine. If you miss a detail, nothing important is lost. So, as we begin, imagine a world with fewer distractions, where evenings were long and quiet, and where people became accustomed to silence. A world where artificial light was limited, and where the sounds of the environment were more noticeable, simply because there was less competing noise. In that kind of setting, stories didn't need to be dramatic to be meaningful. They just needed to be present. This is the kind of world in which the story of Yuki-onna existed, not loudly and not urgently, but patiently, returning again and again in different forms, shaped by the people who remembered it and the conditions under which it was told. And this is where our journey begins. The story associated with Yuki-onna does not appear as a single, clearly defined narrative that unfolds the same way each time it is told. Instead, it exists as a collection of related accounts that developed gradually, shaped by environment, repetition, and lived experience. These accounts were shared quietly, often without emphasis, and rarely with the expectation that they would be remembered exactly. What mattered was not precision, but familiarity. Over time, certain patterns remained while detail shifted, creating a story that felt stable without ever being fixed. In many of the regions where this story was told, winter was not a brief or symbolic season. It was a prolonged period that reshaped daily life. Snow altered familiar paths, softened sound, and made distances difficult to judge. Travel required planning and caution, especially for those moving alone or after daylight had begun to fade. These conditions created a natural setting for stories that did not need exaggeration to feel plausible. The environment itself provided enough uncertainty. Within this setting, Yuki-onna appears not as a sudden intrusion, but as a presence that emerges naturally from the conditions around her. She is not introduced dramatically. She does not announce herself. In most tellings, the encounter occurs during an ordinary journey that has simply become more difficult than expected. The traveler is already tired, already aware of the cold, already focused on reaching shelter. This timing is consistent across many versions. The encounter does not happen when the traveler is alert and energetic. It happens when fatigue has begun to dull awareness. The traveler in these stories is rarely described in personal detail. Their name, age, and background are usually left unstated. They are defined by their movement through the landscape rather than by individual traits. This lack of specificity allows the story to feel applicable to anyone. The traveler could be anyone who has walked a long distance in winter conditions, relying on routine and familiarity rather than excitement or intention. As the traveler moves forward, the world around them begins to feel narrower. Snow reduces contrast, flattening the landscape and making landmarks less distinct. Sound is muted, and movement requires more effort. Breathing becomes more noticeable. These sensations are familiar and understated, and they ground the story in experiences that listeners would recognize. Nothing feels sudden. Nothing feels impossible. At some point, the traveler becomes aware of another presence. This awareness is not always visual at first. It may begin as a subtle change in the atmosphere, a feeling that something has shifted without a clear reason. When the figure does become visible, it is often from a distance. The outline is indistinct, blending into the pale surroundings. It takes time for the traveler to recognize the shape as human. When the figure resolves into the form of a woman, the reaction is usually uncertainty rather than fear. A lone figure in winter conditions raises questions but not immediate alarm. Is she lost? Is she waiting for someone? Is she traveling as well? These questions remain unanswered. The traveler continues forward, drawn by necessity and curiosity rather than caution. Descriptions of Yuki-onna vary from place to place, but certain qualities remain consistent. She is often described as pale, her clothing light in color, sometimes said to resemble the snow itself. She does not appear burdened by the cold. Her movements are unhurried, she does not rush, and she does not seem strained by the conditions. This contrast between her calm presence and the traveler's growing fatigue is subtle but significant. It marks her as different without making her overtly threatening. When she turns to face the traveler, her expression is usually neutral. She does not display strong emotion. If she speaks, her voice is quiet and even, unaffected by the wind or the cold. She may ask a simple question about the journey, such as where the traveler is going or how far they have come. Sometimes she comments on the weather, stating something that is already obvious. In some tellings, she says very little, allowing silence to stretch between words. As the interaction continues, the traveler begins to notice a change in how the cold feels. It does not become sharper or more painful. Instead, it grows heavier, more difficult to ignore. Muscles feel stiff, thoughts slow. The world seems to narrow further, reducing attention to the path ahead and the figure nearby. This change happens gradually, and that gradualness is essential. The story does not rely on sudden transformation. It relies on accumulation. In one common version of the story, Yuki-onna suggests that the traveler stop and rest. The suggestion is not forceful. It is framed as practical and reasonable. The road is difficult. The weather is harsh. Pausing for a moment seems sensible. In these tellings, the danger lies not in deception, but in exhaustion. The traveler is already tired, and the offer of rest feels like relief rather than threat. If the traveler accepts, the story ends quietly. There is no struggle and no dramatic confrontation. Later, the body may be found along the path, frozen and undisturbed. There are no signs of violence and no explanation that fully satisfies those who find it. The encounter remains an explanation rather than a fact, a way of making sense of a loss that otherwise feels sudden and arbitrary. In other versions, the traveler does not stop. Instead, Yuki-onna walks alongside them. She keeps pace effortlessly, her steps light and unmarked in the snow. The traveler, by contrast, becomes increasingly aware of their own fatigue. Each step requires more effort. Breathing becomes shallow. Awareness fades. There is no sense of pursuit or struggle. The body simply begins to fail under conditions it can no longer manage. In these tellings, survival comes not from strength or resistance, but from interruption. Another person appears unexpectedly. A distant light becomes visible through the snow, or the traveler remembers a warning they once heard, prompting them to continue moving despite their exhaustion. When the traveler looks back, Yuki-onna is gone. She does not chase. She does not react. She simply disappears, leaving no trace of her presence. These early versions of the story emphasize restraint. Yuki-onna does not act with urgency. She does not display anger or desire. Her presence coincides with danger rather than causing it. She appears where conditions are already harsh, reflecting risks that exist regardless of her involvement. In this way, the story avoids framing her as a villain. She is not something to be defeated or escaped. She is something to be encountered briefly and quietly under specific conditions. This approach allowed the story to remain flexible. It could be told as a warning, a memory, or simply as something that had been heard before. It did not require belief or interpretation. It existed alongside daily experience, reinforcing what people already knew about winter, travel, and exhaustion without insisting on meaning or resolution. In other tellings of the story, the setting shifts away from open roads and mountain paths and moves closer to places of shelter, where the contrast between warmth and cold becomes more pronounced. These versions often take place near the edges of villages or at isolated homes where winter nights stretch long and quiet. In these stories, Yuki-onna does not appear suddenly inside a home. She waits outside, just beyond the reach of firelight, where the boundary between safety and exposure remains visible. Those who notice her often do so by chance, catching sight of a pale figure standing still where no one should remain for long. In these village-based versions, her presence is not accompanied by threat or urgency. She does not force entry or raise her voice. Instead, she may knock softly or simply stand and wait until noticed. When she speaks, her words are few and measured. She may ask for shelter or for a moment of warmth, framing the request as something reasonable given the conditions. These requests are not framed as demands. They rely on the natural impulse to help, especially during harsh weather. The danger in these tellings does not come from deception, but from distraction and fatigue. If the occupants of the home are tired, inattentive, or overly trusting, the warmth of the room may begin to fade. The fire burns lower, the air grows colder. Those inside may become drowsy without realizing why. In versions where harm occurs, it does so quietly. There is no struggle and no clear moment of realization. When others arrive later, they find no signs of intrusion, only the absence of warmth and the stillness of the room. In gentler versions of these stories, Yuki-onna leaves without incident. If the occupants remain alert, if they refuse entry, or if someone else intervenes, she withdraws without protest. She does not linger or react emotionally. Her departure is as quiet as her arrival, reinforcing the idea that she does not act with personal intent. These versions often emphasize caution rather than fear, suggesting that attentiveness itself is enough to remain safe. There are also tellings in which Yuki-onna appears within the village itself, walking through streets covered in snow or standing near wells and pathways during late hours. In these accounts, she is observed rather than encountered. People notice her presence briefly, then look away, only to find her gone when they look again. These sightings are rarely followed by immediate consequences. Instead, they serve as reminders that winter has settled fully and that certain routines should change accordingly. One of the most widely remembered variations of the legend introduces a longer and more complex relationship between Yuki-onna and a human. In these versions, a traveler encounters her during a storm and survives not because of interruption, but because she chooses to spare him. The reason is rarely explained. She does not express sympathy or attachment. She simply allows him to live under one condition. He must never speak of the encounter to anyone. The condition is stated plainly without elaboration. The traveler agrees, often without fully understanding why the promise matters. After this, the story shifts away from winter and danger and returns to ordinary life. The traveler settles into familiar routines. He marries a woman who appears gentle, reserved, and attentive. Together, they build a household and raise children. Life unfolds quietly, without incident. The earlier encounter fades into memory, becoming something distant and rarely considered. In these versions, the wife is often described as calm and capable, well suited to domestic life. She does not draw attention to herself, and nothing about her behavior suggests anything unusual. Years pass without disruption. The story takes its time here, emphasizing routine and stability, reinforcing the sense that the encounter belongs firmly in the past. Eventually, during a quiet moment, the promise is broken. Sometimes this happens accidentally during conversation. Sometimes it is prompted by curiosity or reflection. The traveler speaks of the encounter without realizing the weight of his words. When he finishes, his wife reveals herself to be Yuki-onna. This revelation is not accompanied by dramatic transformation. There is no sudden shift in tone or emotion. She does not express anger or betrayal. She expresses disappointment. In most versions, she explains that the promise has been broken and that she can no longer remain. She does not punish the traveler or harm the children. Instead, she leaves, disappearing quietly and returning to the winter. The story ends without resolution. There is no explanation of what becomes of her, and no attempt to repair what has been lost. The emphasis is on absence rather than consequence. Other tellings adjust this version slightly, changing details while retaining the same structure. In some, the wife vanishes immediately after the promise is broken. In others, she remains long enough to ensure the children's safety before leaving. These differences reflect regional values and concerns, but they do not alter the core tone of the story. The departure is always quiet. The loss is felt, but not dramatized. Some regions offer explanations for Yuki-onna's nature, while others leave it entirely unaddressed. In certain tellings, she is said to have once been human, transformed by death, grief, or isolation during winter. These origin stories are usually vague, offering suggestions rather than details. In other regions, she is described as entirely inhuman, a being formed from snow and cold without history or purpose. These explanations are not emphasized. They exist at the edges of the story, optional rather than central. Across all versions, certain qualities remain consistent. Yuki-onna is calm. She does not rush. She does not pursue. She does not act out of anger or desire. Her presence coincides with moments of vulnerability, when people are tired, distracted, or isolated. She does not create danger. She reflects it. The story does not portray her as evil or malicious. She is not a villain to be defeated. Instead, she embodies conditions that already exist. Cold, exhaustion, and isolation are not moral forces. They are indifferent. Yuki-onna reflects that indifference, appearing where those conditions are strongest. As time passed and circumstances changed, the story adapted. Improved travel, better. Shelter and modern conveniences reduced the immediate danger of winter, and encounters with Yuki-onna became less common in everyday conversation. However, the legend did not disappear. It shifted into literature, art, and seasonal storytelling, sometimes becoming more symbolic, sometimes remaining close to its earlier forms. What allows the story to endure is not its plot, but its restraint. It does not insist on interpretation or belief. It unfolds slowly with minimal explanation, and it ends quietly. Like winter itself, it arrives without announcement and leaves without resolution, remaining present in memory long after the conditions that created it have passed. To understand why stories like the one associated with Yuki-onna felt natural rather than extraordinary, it helps to step away from the story itself and spend time with the world in which it existed. This was a world shaped by routine, repetition, and close attention to the environment, not because people sought meaning in every detail, but because daily life required it. Small changes mattered. Weather, light, and temperature influenced decisions constantly, often without being consciously acknowledged. In many rural areas, daily life followed patterns that shifted with the seasons. Work began early and ended when light faded, especially during times of year when daylight was limited. People planned tasks carefully, knowing that unfinished work might need to wait, and that conditions could change suddenly. Winter altered these routines significantly. Movement slowed, outdoor work became more difficult. Even simple tasks required additional effort and planning. These changes were not dramatic. They were gradual, unfolding over weeks rather than days, and people adapted to them quietly. Travel during colder months was undertaken only when necessary. Paths that were familiar and manageable in warmer seasons could become treacherous once snow settled. Landmarks were obscured, distances felt longer. A journey that might normally take a short time could stretch unexpectedly, especially if weather worsened. Because of this, people paid close attention to timing, often leaving earlier than needed or choosing to delay travel altogether. These decisions were based not on fear, but on experience. Homes offered shelter, but they were not sealed environments. Cold entered gradually, and warmth had to be maintained rather than assumed. Fires were tended carefully, fuel was conserved, and living spaces were arranged to retain heat as much as possible. Even indoors, the presence of winter was felt. Air felt heavier. Sounds changed. Movement slowed. These sensations were familiar and unremarkable, part of the background of daily life rather than something to be commented on. Evenings were long, particularly during winter months. With limited artificial light, activities slowed naturally. People gathered, worked quietly or simply rested. Silence was common and not uncomfortable. In these moments, conversation was unhurried. Stories did not interrupt the quiet, they blended into it, shared without emphasis or expectation. A story might be mentioned briefly, then dropped, only to return later when circumstances felt appropriate. Food preparation followed seasonal rhythms as well. Ingredients were limited by availability, and preservation was essential. Meals were simple, focused on nourishment rather than variety. Eating was not rushed, especially in the evening when the pace of the day eased. These shared moments reinforced routine and familiarity, providing a sense of continuity even as conditions outside changed. Isolation was a common experience, particularly in less populated regions. Villages could be separated by long stretches of forest, mountain paths, or open land that became difficult to cross during winter. Communication was slower, and contact with others was limited. People became accustomed to spending time alone or within small groups. This isolation was not necessarily distressing. It was expected, and people adapted to it as part of life. Because of this, awareness of the environment was constant. People noticed changes in sound, light, and temperature without deliberate effort. A sudden stillness, an unfamiliar noise, or a subtle shift in weather could signal that something was different. These observations were not always discussed openly, but they were remembered. Over time, they shaped expectations and influenced behavior. When someone failed to return from a journey, the absence was felt deeply. There were often no clear answers, only speculation and memory. Over time, these experiences accumulated, shaping how people thought about risk and uncertainty. Stories emerged not to dramatize these events, but to acknowledge them. They provided a way to speak about loss without requiring explanation. Children grew up hearing fragments of stories rather than complete narratives. Names were mentioned, situations were alluded to, warnings were given without detail. Over time, familiarity developed without formal instruction. Stories became part of the background, something that felt known even if it was never fully explained. This gradual exposure allowed stories to persist without needing to be retold in full. As people aged, their relationship with these stories changed. What once felt mysterious became familiar. What once felt distant became connected to personal experience. A story heard in childhood might be understood differently later in life, shaped by memories of travel, loss, or solitude. Stories were not static. They shifted as individuals accumulated their own experiences. The environment itself reinforced these patterns. Seasonal changes were predictable in a general sense, but unpredictable in detail. No two winters were exactly the same. Snowfall varied, temperatures fluctuated, paths changed. People adapted by remaining cautious and observant, adjusting routines as needed. Stories provided continuity in this shifting landscape, offering familiarity without certainty. Over time, certain places became associated with particular stories or warnings. A road that was difficult in winter, a forest path that felt isolating. These associations were not always based on direct experience. They were reinforced by shared memory, passed down quietly through repetition rather than instruction. Stories did not demand belief. They influenced behavior subtly, shaping decisions without requiring explanation. As daily life continued, stories like this remained present without dominating attention. They were part of the background, ready to surface when circumstances felt familiar enough to invite them back. This quiet presence is what allowed them to endure. They did not need to be emphasized. They simply needed to be remembered. As winter settled more deeply into daily life, time itself seemed to change. Days felt shorter, not only because of reduced daylight, but because fewer activities could be carried out safely. Tasks that were routine in other seasons became slower and more deliberate. People adjusted their expectations without discussion, knowing that productivity would decline and that patience would be required. This shift was not marked by a single moment. It happened gradually as the environment imposed its rhythm. Nighttime routines became especially important during winter months. Once darkness fell, movement outside the home was limited. People stayed indoors unless there was a clear reason to leave, and even then, caution was taken. Lamps and fires provided limited light, creating small pockets of warmth and visibility within larger spaces of shadow. The world beyond these boundaries felt distant and indistinct, reinforcing the sense of separation between inside and outside, safety and exposure. Within the home, activities slowed. Tools were repaired. Food was prepared for the following days, and simple tasks filled the hours. Conversation, when it occurred, was unhurried. Silence was common and accepted. In these moments, people became more aware of their own thoughts, of the passing of time, and of the subtle sounds of the environment. The wind outside, the settling of the structure, the quiet movement of others in nearby rooms. Waiting was a familiar part of life, waiting for weather to change, waiting for daylight, waiting for someone to return. This waiting was not framed as inactivity. It was understood as a necessary part of survival. People learned to be still without becoming restless, to occupy themselves without urgency. Stories fit naturally into these periods of waiting, offering continuity without requiring attention. Isolation during winter was not always physical. Even when people were together, there was a sense of separation from the wider world. News traveled slowly and information was limited. People relied on memory, routine, and shared understanding rather than constant updates. This created a different relationship with uncertainty. Not everything needed to be explained immediately. Some things were simply accepted as part of life. In this context, stories associated with figures like Yuki-onna did not stand out as extraordinary. They reflected conditions people already knew. Fatigue, isolation, and vulnerability were familiar experiences, not abstract concepts. Stories provided a way to acknowledge these realities without dwelling on them directly. They allowed people to speak indirectly about risk and loss, using familiar imagery rather than explicit explanation. Seasonal isolation also influenced how people thought about distance. Places that felt close during warmer months felt far away in winter. A neighboring village might as well have been separated by a much greater distance once snow settled. This altered perception of space affected decision-making. People weighed risks carefully, often choosing to stay put rather than attempt unnecessary journeys. Stories reinforced this caution, not through instruction, but through familiarity. Emotional responses to winter were shaped by this environment. There was little expectation of excitement or novelty. Instead, stability and predictability were valued. People took comfort in routine, even when conditions were difficult. This emotional landscape influenced the tone of stories that emerged. They were calm, restrained, and understated, reflecting the way people approached daily life during long winters. Children experienced this environment differently from adults. They learned routines through observation rather than instruction. They heard fragments of stories without context, absorbing them gradually. Over time, these fragments became familiar, shaping expectations and behavior without requiring explanation. A child might know that certain paths were avoided in winter, or that certain times of day felt less safe without being told why explicitly. As children grew older, their understanding of these stories evolved. What once felt mysterious became connected to personal experience. A story heard in childhood might take on new meaning after a long journey, a difficult winter, or a loss. Stories were not static lessons. They were living references, reshaped by experience and memory. The passage of time during winter reinforced these patterns. Without constant activity or distraction, people became more aware of gradual changes. The lengthening of days, the softening of snow, the return of certain sounds. These transitions were noted quietly without celebration. Stories adapted to these shifts, appearing more often during certain periods and fading during others. In many ways, winter encouraged reflection. With fewer immediate demands, people had space to think, remember, and observe. Stories offered a shared framework for this reflection, allowing individuals to connect their own experiences to a broader cultural memory. This connection did not require belief or analysis. It existed simply through repetition and familiarity. Even as conditions improved and winter began to ease, the influence of this season lingered. Decisions made during winter affected routines long after snow melted. Paths avoided during cold months might remain unused out of habit. Stories told during winter might be remembered later, shaping behavior even when conditions changed. This persistence reinforced the role of stories as quiet guides rather than explicit instructions. Over generations, these patterns became embedded in daily life. Stories were not preserved intentionally. They survived because they fit naturally into the rhythms of living. They did not demand attention or interpretation. They accompanied routine, offering familiarity without disruption. Understanding this broader context helps explain why stories like this endured without needing to be emphasized. They were not extraordinary additions to daily life. They were reflections of it. They mirrored the way people moved through the world, responded to uncertainty, and adapted to changing conditions. And it is within this quiet, patient environment that such stories found their place, remaining present without insistence, ready to return whenever circumstances felt familiar enough to bring them back. Stories like the one associated with Yuki-onna rarely existed alone. They were remembered alongside other stories that arose from similar conditions, shaped by comparable environments and shared experiences. These stories were not grouped together intentionally, nor were they compared in a formal way. Instead, they existed side by side, connected quietly through repetition and familiarity. Over time, people came to recognize certain similarities without needing to name them, simply because the stories felt related. In regions where winter shaped daily life, stories often reflected the same underlying concerns. Travel was uncertain, isolation was common, fatigue accumulated slowly. These experiences were not unique to one place or one culture. Wherever people lived close to the land and depended on their ability to move safely through changing environments, similar stories emerged. They did not copy one another directly. They developed independently, responding to the same kinds of conditions. Many of these stories involved encounters that occurred during moments of vulnerability. A traveler moving alone. A person caught out later than expected. Someone resting when they should have continued on. The figures encountered in these stories were rarely aggressive or overtly threatening. They appeared calmly, often without warning, and their presence marked a shift rather than an attack. The danger lay not in confrontation, but in the circumstances surrounding the encounter. In some stories, the figure appeared along a road or path, standing where no one should linger. In others, the figure emerged near the edge of a village, or at the boundary between shelter and exposure. These locations were not chosen for dramatic effect. They reflected real points of transition, where safety was uncertain and decisions carried greater weight. Stories that unfolded in these spaces reinforced the importance of awareness without stating it directly. Across different regions, similar figures were described as pale, quiet, and unhurried. They did not rush toward travelers or pursue them. They observed, waited, or walked alongside, moving with ease where humans struggled. This contrast emphasized human vulnerability without assigning blame or intention. The figures did not need to act forcefully. Their difference alone was enough to shape the encounter. Some stories emphasized silence more than action. Conversations, if they occurred at all, were brief and understated. Questions were simple. Responses were minimal. Often, the most significant moments in these stories involved what was not said. Silence allowed listeners to project their own experiences into the story, filling gaps without being directed to do so. This quality made the stories adaptable, able to resonate across different circumstances. In other tellings, the focus shifted to restraint rather than danger. The figure might warn a traveler to turn back or suggest that conditions were worsening. These warnings were not framed as commands. They were offered calmly, leaving the choice to the listener. When the advice was followed, nothing dramatic happened. When it was ignored, the outcome was uncertain. These stories did not insist on obedience. They illustrated consequences quietly. Many related stories also involved conditions or boundaries. A figure might allow someone to pass only if a simple rule was followed. The rule was rarely complex. It might involve silence, respect, or restraint. These conditions were not enforced through punishment. When they were broken, the figure withdrew rather than retaliated. The connection ended quietly. This pattern reinforced the idea that some encounters were temporary by nature and not meant to be sustained. In coastal regions, similar stories emerged in different settings. Instead of snow and cold, the environment involved fog, storms, or unfamiliar shorelines. Figures appeared briefly, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes simply observing. The danger lay in the environment rather than the figure. These stories shared the same tone as inland winter legends, emphasizing caution without dramatization. Mountain regions produced their own variations, shaped by elevation, narrow paths, and sudden changes in weather. Figures encountered in these settings often moved effortlessly where humans struggled, reinforcing the contrast between the natural world and human limitation. As with winter legends, these stories did not frame the figures as enemies. They reflected the risks already present in the environment. Across all of these stories, a lack of origin was common. Figures were rarely given detailed histories or explanations. They simply existed, appearing when conditions allowed and disappearing when circumstances changed. This absence of backstory mirrored how people experience the natural world itself. Mountains, storms, and seasons did not require explanations to be respected. They were accepted as they were. As stories were repeated over time, details shifted, names changed, settings varied, certain elements were emphasized or omitted, but the underlying structure remained consistent. Encounters occurred during moments of vulnerability. Outcomes were quiet rather than dramatic. Meaning was suggested rather than stated. These shared patterns allowed stories to remain familiar even as circumstances changed. People did not need to consciously compare these stories to recognize their similarities. The connections formed naturally through repetition and shared experience. Hearing one story made another feel familiar, even if the details differed. This familiarity reinforced cultural memory without requiring formal instruction or explanation. In this way, stories supported one another quietly. They formed a loose network of ideas rather than a rigid system. Each story reflected a slightly different aspect of the same lived reality, reinforcing common understandings through variation rather than repetition. This network did not demand attention. It existed in the background, shaping expectations subtly over time. By recognizing these shared patterns, listeners could understand each story not as an isolated event, but as part of a broader landscape of experience. The story we are exploring fits naturally within this landscape, not as a central example, but as one expression among many. It exists alongside other stories that developed under similar conditions, shaped by similar concerns and remembered in similar ways, continuing quietly without insistence, ready to surface whenever circumstances felt familiar enough to bring it back. As these stories continued to circulate over time, their similarities became familiar even to those who could not have named them. People did not need to compare details or trace origins to sense that certain stories belong together. The connection was felt rather than understood, shaped by repeated exposure and shared experience. Hearing one story made another feel recognizable, not because the events were the same, but because the atmosphere was. The same quiet tension, the same emphasis on waiting, restraint, and awareness, the same absence of urgency. Across many regions and cultures, stories emerged that reflected moments when the ordinary world felt slightly altered. These moments were not dramatic. They did not involve sudden danger or clear transformation. Instead, they occurred when familiar routines were disrupted just enough to feel uncertain. A journey took longer than expected. Weather changed subtly. Light faded earlier than anticipated. In these moments, stories often placed a figure nearby, not as a threat, but as a sign that conditions had shifted. In these stories, the figures encountered were often calm and composed. They did not rush or raise their voices. Their presence did not create chaos. Instead, it highlighted what was already there: fatigue, isolation, reduced awareness. This quality made the stories feel realistic rather than fantastical. The figures did not introduce danger, they revealed it. A recurring emotional theme in many of these legends is quiet uncertainty. Characters rarely know exactly what they are encountering, and they are not given clear instructions on how to respond. There is no guide, no explanation, and no authoritative voice. The story unfolds without telling the listener what to think. This mirrors real experiences. where people often must make decisions without full information, relying on intuition, habit, and past experience. Another shared element is the absence of reward. In many stories, nothing positive is gained from the encounter. Survival is not celebrated. Avoidance is not praised. The best possible outcome is often simply continuation. Life goes on as it did before, unchanged and unremarkable. This lack of reward reinforces the idea that the encounter was not meant to be meaningful in a dramatic sense. It was simply part of the environment. Similarly, punishment is rarely emphasized. When harm occurs, it is not framed as deserved or intentional. It happens quietly, without judgment. This approach avoids moralizing the story, allowing it to remain open and adaptable. The listener is not instructed to behave a certain way. They are simply shown what can happen under certain conditions. These stories also share a tendency to avoid clear endings. Encounters often conclude without explanation. The figure disappears, the journey continues, or life resumes without resolution. This lack of closure is not presented as a problem. It reflects how many experiences end in reality without understanding or certainty. The story accepts this without attempting to correct it. In many cases, the figures within these stories are associated with specific times rather than specific actions. They appear at night, during storms, or at transitional moments between seasons. This timing reinforces their connection to the environment rather than to human behavior. The figure is not summoned by wrongdoing or intent. It arrives when conditions align. Because of this, the stories feel less like cautionary tales and more like observations. They do not instruct listeners to avoid certain actions. They describe what has been noticed over time. This observational quality gives the stories a sense of neutrality. They are not warnings issued by authority. They are reflections of experience. Another pattern that appears repeatedly is the role of attention. In many stories, those who remain alert, who notice small changes, or who continue moving tend to fare better than those who stop or become distracted. This emphasis is subtle. It is not framed as advice. It emerges naturally from the way events unfold. The story does not say that attentiveness will ensure safety. It simply shows that inattention can be risky. Silence plays an important role in reinforcing these themes. Conversations, when they occur, are brief and understated. Often, the most significant moments happen without words. The absence of dialogue creates space for the listener's own experiences to fill in the gaps. This openness allows the story to resonate differently with each person, depending on what they bring to it. These shared patterns also reflect a broader cultural relationship with uncertainty. In many of the environments where these stories developed, unpredictability was a constant presence. Weather changed, travel was delayed, plans were interrupted. Rather than seeking control, people learned to adapt. Stories mirrored this approach. They did not promise solutions. They acknowledged limits. As societies changed and daily life became more structured and predictable, many of these stories were reinterpreted. They were written down, categorized, and sometimes explained in ways that earlier versions avoided. However, the older forms persisted alongside these adaptations, remembered for their restraint rather than their detail. The quiet versions continued to circulate, valued for their atmosphere rather than their clarity. The story associated with Yuki-onna fits naturally within this broader pattern. It shares the same calm tone, the same emphasis on environment and the same avoidance of clear resolution. It does not stand out because it is more dramatic or more complete. It stands out because it reflects a familiar way of understanding the world, one that accepts uncertainty without resistance. By viewing this story alongside others that share similar qualities, its role becomes clearer. It is not meant to instruct, entertain, or explain. It is meant to accompany experience, to exist quietly in the background of memory, ready to surface when circumstances feel familiar enough to bring it back. Its meaning, if it has one at all, is not contained in its details, but in its tone. These shared patterns allowed stories like this to persist without needing reinforcement. They were not preserved intentionally. They survived because they fit naturally into the rhythms of life. They did not demand attention. They waited, and when conditions aligned, they returned, not as lessons or warnings, but as familiar presences, reminding listeners of experiences they already understood, even if they could not fully explain them. When stories like the one associated with Yuki-onna are remembered over long periods of time, they naturally gather layers of interpretation. These interpretations were not usually discussed openly or debated. Instead, they existed quietly, shaped by personal experience, local conditions, and the moment in which the story was heard. Meaning was not fixed or agreed upon. It shifted gently, allowing the story to remain familiar without becoming rigid. For some listeners, the story was understood as a reflection of the natural world itself. Winter, cold, and exhaustion were not abstract ideas. They were lived realities. Personifying these experiences allowed people to speak about them indirectly, without needing to describe danger in literal terms. In this understanding, Yuki-onna was not a character with intention or desire, but a way of giving form to conditions that already existed. The story did not suggest that winter was cruel or malicious. It simply acknowledged that winter was indifferent and that indifference could be dangerous. Others understood the story as a quiet reminder of human limits. No matter how familiar a path might seem, no matter how experienced a traveler was, conditions could change. Fatigue could dull awareness. Small decisions could have lasting consequences. The story did not frame these ideas as moral lessons. It did not suggest that mistakes were punished. Instead, it reflected the reality that the environment does not adjust itself to human plans. Some interpretations focused less on danger and more on awareness. In many tellings, harm occurs not because of an active threat, but because of inattention, stopping too long, failing to continue moving, becoming distracted. These moments are not dramatic, they are ordinary. The story highlights them quietly, allowing listeners to recognize patterns without being told what to think. In this sense, the story functions more as an observation than a warning. There are also interpretations that emphasize boundaries. Yuki-onna often appears at moments of transition, along roads, at village edges, or during shifts in weather. These are places and times where certainty is reduced. The story does not suggest that these boundaries should be avoided entirely. It suggests that they require care. Crossing them is not forbidden, but it is not without risk. This understanding aligns closely with lived experience, where many situations are not clearly safe or dangerous, but exist somewhere in between. In versions of the story that involve promises or conditions, interpretations often shift toward ideas of restraint and memory. The promise not to speak of the encounter is rarely explained. Its importance becomes clear only after it is broken. Some listeners understood this as a reflection of how certain experiences lose their power when spoken about casually. Others saw it as a reminder that not all encounters are meant to be shared or understood fully. In either case, the consequence is not punishment, but loss. The connection ends quietly without confrontation. Another interpretation centers on loneliness. In some tellings, Yuki-onna is distant rather than threatening. She appears briefly, interacts minimally, and then disappears. This portrayal resonates with environments where isolation is common, especially during long winters. From this perspective, the story reflects the emotional landscape of people who lived with extended periods of solitude. The figure becomes less a danger and more a presence shaped by separation and stillness. Some listeners understood the story simply as tradition, without seeking deeper meaning at all. It was something that had always been told, and so it continued to be told. In this view, the value of the story lies not in what it represents, but in the act of remembering it. Sharing the story reinforces continuity, connecting one generation to the next without requiring explanation. This interpretation does not diminish the story. It reflects a different way of valuing it. Importantly, these interpretations did not replace one another. They existed simultaneously, overlapping and shifting depending on context. A story might feel like a warning in one moment and like a reflection of nature in another. It might feel distant and abstract to one listener and deeply personal to another. This openness allowed the story to adapt without changing its structure. It could mean different things at different times without losing its identity. The lack of a clear conclusion in the story supports this openness. There is no final judgment, no definitive lesson, and no authoritative explanation. Events unfold, and then they end. This mirrors real experience, where outcomes are not always understood and meaning is not always clear. The story does not resolve uncertainty. It allows it to remain. Because of this, interpretation becomes part of the listening experience rather than a destination. Meaning may emerge quietly, or it may not emerge at all. The story does not insist on being understood. It offers space instead. Space for reflection, space for familiarity, space for rest. This quality makes the story particularly suited to moments of quiet. It does not compete for attention. It does not demand analysis. It exists comfortably alongside other thoughts, allowing the mind to drift without resistance. Interpretation, if it occurs, does so gently without effort. By remaining open and unresolved, the story avoids becoming fixed or outdated. It remains flexible, able to coexist with changing circumstances and new perspectives. Listeners are free to bring their own experiences into the story, finding familiarity without being directed toward a specific understanding. This freedom is not emphasized or explained. It is simply present, waiting quietly, like the story itself. As these interpretations continued to exist side by side, they did not compete with one another. No single understanding replaced the others, and none was treated as more correct or complete. Instead, they layered gently, allowing the story associated with Yuki-onna to remain flexible and open. This flexibility was not accidental. It reflected a way of thinking that accepted uncertainty as part of life rather than something that needed to be resolved. For some listeners, the story was less about danger and more about balance. Winter demanded adjustments in behavior, pace, and expectation. Pushing too hard, ignoring fatigue, or refusing to adapt could lead to harm. In this understanding, the story does not punish recklessness, nor does it reward caution explicitly. It simply reflects what happens when balance is lost. The environment responds without emotion, and the story mirrors that response. Others interpreted the story as a reminder of how easily familiar things can change. A road walked many times before becomes unfamiliar under snow. A routine journey becomes difficult without warning. A quiet encounter alters the course of a life. These changes are not framed as dramatic turning points. They are subtle shifts recognized only after they occur. The story captures this gradual transition, allowing listeners to recognize the feeling without being directed toward a specific lesson. There are interpretations that focus on the role of memory. In many versions, encounters with Yuki-onna are remembered imperfectly or spoken of only in fragments. Details blur. Timelines fade. What remains is not a clear sequence of events, but an impression. This reflects how memory often works in real life, especially around experiences shaped by stress, fatigue, or isolation. The story does not attempt to correct this. It allows memory to remain uncertain. Some listeners understood the story as a reflection of emotional states rather than physical conditions. Long winters, isolation, and limited interaction could affect mood and perception. Feelings of heaviness, detachment, or distance might be expressed through imagery rather than words. In this view, Yuki-onna becomes less a figure encountered in the world and more a presence that represents emotional stillness or withdrawal. The story does not insist on this interpretation, but it allows room for it. Other interpretations focus on restraint in communication. The promise not to speak of an encounter appears in several versions of the story, but its meaning is never explained. Breaking the promise does not result in violence or punishment. It results in separation. Some listeners saw this as a reflection of how certain experiences lose their significance when shared carelessly. Others understood it as a reminder that some things exist only within the moment and cannot be carried forward without changing. In this sense, the story does not frame silence as secrecy or deception. It frames silence as preservation. What is left unspoken retains its shape. Once spoken, it dissolves. This idea appears quietly, without emphasis, allowing listeners to decide for themselves whether it resonates. The story does not argue for silence. It simply shows what happens when silence ends. There are also interpretations that emphasize impermanence. Encounters with Yuki-onna are brief. She does not linger. She does not remain part of the traveler's life indefinitely. Even in versions where she becomes a spouse, her presence is temporary. The story does not treat this impermanence as tragic or unjust. It presents it as natural. Things arrive, things depart. Not everything is meant to last. Some listeners viewed the story as a reminder that not all relationships are built to endure. Some exist only within specific conditions. When those conditions change, the relationship ends quietly. This understanding aligns with many aspects of life, where connections are shaped by circumstance rather than intention. The story reflects this without explanation or judgment. Another recurring interpretation centers on attentiveness. In many tellings, survival is linked not to strength or intelligence, but to awareness. Noticing changes, continuing to move, recognizing when conditions have shifted. These moments are not emphasized as heroic. They are ordinary. The story does not celebrate them. It simply shows that attentiveness can make a difference. Importantly, the story does not suggest that attentiveness guarantees safety. Even those who are cautious may still encounter harm. This lack of assurance keeps the story grounded. It does not promise control. It acknowledges limits. This acceptance of uncertainty is one of the reasons the story remains calming rather than frightening. It does not exaggerate risk. It accepts it. Over time, listeners may move between interpretations without noticing. A story heard as a child may feel mysterious. The same story heard later may feel practical. Heard again, it may feel symbolic or distant. The story allows this movement. It does not require consistency. It adapts to the listener rather than demanding a fixed understanding. Because of this, interpretation becomes a personal experience rather than a shared conclusion. Two people can hear the same story and carry away entirely different impressions, both valid within their own contexts. The story does not correct them. It does not insist on alignment. It remains open. This openness is reinforced by the way the story ends, or rather, does not end. There is no resolution that ties meaning together. There is no final statement that clarifies intent. The story simply stops, leaving space rather than filling it. This absence invites reflection without demanding it. In moments of quiet, this quality becomes especially noticeable. The story does not intrude on rest. It does not provoke thought unless thought naturally arises. It allows the listener to drift, carrying whatever impression feels appropriate and letting the rest fade away. Interpretation, if it happens at all, happens gently. By remaining unresolved, the story avoids becoming fixed in time. It continues to exist as something that can be returned to without effort, adapting to new circumstances and new listeners without needing to change its form. Its meaning is not contained in its details, but in its ability to remain present without insistence. And so the story continues to exist in this open state, neither fully explained nor entirely mysterious, offering impressions rather than answers, and allowing each listener to decide how much, if anything, they wish to carry with them as the narration continues quietly onward. As stories like the one associated with Yuki-onna gradually moved away from the center of daily life, they did not vanish so much as they softened. They became less urgent, less frequently spoken, and less clearly defined. Rather than being shared in full, they remained in fragments, impressions, and familiar names that resurfaced only when conditions felt right. This quiet persistence allowed the story to remain present without demanding attention, existing comfortably in the background of memory. Over time, the environments that once gave these stories their immediacy began to change. Roads became easier to travel, shelter became more reliable, artificial light extended evenings and altered routines. Noise filled spaces that were once quiet. Yet, even as these changes took place, certain moments remained unchanged. Long periods of stillness, isolated places, weather that altered familiar landscapes without warning. In those moments, the feeling that once gave rise to stories like this could still be sensed, even if it was no longer named. The story does not attempt to return forcefully. It does not insist on being remembered. It waits quietly, resting beneath the surface of everyday experience. When circumstances align, when silence becomes noticeable, or when the environment feels unfamiliar again, the story surfaces naturally. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes present, like a familiar thought that returns without being summoned. As the narration continues now, there is no need to hold on to what has already been said. The details do not need to be retained, and the connections do not need to be traced. The story does not build toward a conclusion that needs to be recognized. Instead, it settles gradually, allowing the pace of thought to slow without effort. Attention can soften, awareness can drift. Nothing important depends on staying focused. Stories like this were never designed to end sharply. They faded naturally, often interrupted by sleep, silence, or the simple passing of time. Their purpose was not to reach a final point, but to accompany a moment. Once that moment passed, the story rested until it was needed again, if it was needed at all. This quality made them especially suited to evenings and nights, when activity slowed and reflection came more easily. You may notice that the rhythm of the narration remains steady and unchanging. This steadiness is intentional. Just as the story does not build toward excitement, it does not move quickly toward rest. It maintains a consistent presence, offering familiarity rather than stimulation. This allows the mind to relax without being guided or directed. In quiet moments, the boundary between listening and not listening becomes less important. Words may register clearly for a time, then fade into the background. Thoughts may arise briefly, then dissolve. The story does not react to this shift. It continues unchanged, allowing each listener to engage with it in whatever way feels most comfortable. Imagine a setting where there is nothing to respond to and nothing to anticipate. A place where time moves without urgency and where stillness feels natural rather than empty. In such a space, stories do not stand out as separate events. They blend gently into the environment, becoming part of the atmosphere rather than something to follow. This is how stories like this were often experienced, not as performances, but as companions to quiet moments. They existed alongside routine, not interrupting it, and they ended not with resolution, but with rest. When sleep arrived, the story simply continued without the listener, unchanged and unconcerned. As attention softens, the story becomes less about content and more about rhythm, the steady movement of words. The predictable tone, the absence of urgency. These qualities allow the mind to release its grip on detail, drifting toward a state where thoughts no longer need to be organized or directed. If memories surface while listening, they can be allowed to pass without examination. If images form, they do not need to be held. The story does not encourage reflection or analysis. It provides a background in which such things can arise and fade naturally, without effort. The quiet persistence of the story mirrors the way it has existed across time. Not always present, but never entirely gone, waiting without expectation, returning without announcement. It does not ask to be remembered correctly or completely. It accepts partial memory and gradual fading as part of its nature. As the narration continues, it remains open-ended. There is no signal that it is nearing completion, no shift in tone to suggest that something is about to end. This lack of signaling allows rest to arrive naturally without interruption. Sleep, if it comes, does so quietly, and so the story remains steady and unhurried, offering no destination and no demand. It accompanies the moment as long as it is needed, and when it is no longer noticed, it continues quietly on its own, unchanged, patient, and at ease. As the story continues, it becomes less important to distinguish where one idea ends and another begins. The narration does not move forward with purpose or direction. It remains present, steady and unhurried, allowing time to stretch naturally. This mirrors the way stories like the one associated with Yuki-onna were often experienced, not as complete narratives, but as something that existed alongside rest, waiting, and quiet awareness. At this point, listening does not require effort. Words can be heard without being followed. Meaning can soften without disappearing. The story does not insist on clarity. It does not ask to be understood or remembered. It simply remains, moving at a pace slow enough that attention no longer needs to hold on. In moments like this, the boundary between the story and the surrounding environment becomes less distinct. The sound of the narration blends with other quiet sounds or with silence itself. The rhythm stays the same, offering predictability without emphasis. Nothing changes suddenly. Nothing demands response. This is often how the end of the day was experienced in the environments where such stories emerged. Activity faded gradually, tasks were set aside one by one, light diminished, conversation slowed. There was no clear transition from wakefulness to rest, only a gentle shift as awareness loosened. Stories accompanied this process without guiding it. As you continue listening, there is no need to monitor your thoughts. If they drift, they can drift. If they pause, they can pause. The story does not react. It does not follow your attention or attempt to regain it. It remains consistent, allowing the mind to settle at its own pace. In earlier times, long stretches of quiet were common. People became familiar with stillness, not as an absence, but as a presence in its own right. Stories that existed in this context reflected that familiarity. They did not compete with silence. They coexisted with it, leaving space rather than filling it completely. The narration now functions in the same way. It does not seek to replace silence. It rests beside it. If the words fade into the background, that is expected. If they return briefly to awareness, that is also fine. The story does not change in response. There is no moment you need to stay awake for, no detail that must be heard. The story does not build toward anything that could be missed. It remains even without variation, allowing rest to deepen without interruption. As time passes, the sense of sequence becomes less important. It no longer matters what came before or what might come next. The narration exists in the present moment only, repeating its calm presence, without progression. This lack of movement is intentional. It allows the mind to disengage from anticipation. If sleep begins to arrive, it does so without ceremony. There is no final thought to hold on to, no closing image. The story does not mark the transition. It simply continues, unchanged, as awareness fades. This is how many stories were once experienced. Not finished, not concluded, but left behind mid-thought, mid-sentence, mid-impression, as rest took over. The story did not need to be completed to have served its purpose. Its purpose was not completion, but accompaniment. Even now, the narration does not suggest that anything is ending. It does not slow further or change tone. It does not prepare for silence. It maintains the same gentle rhythm, allowing the listener to leave without being guided out. If attention returns briefly, it finds the same calm presence waiting. Nothing has shifted. Nothing has progressed. The story remains exactly where it was, patient and unaltered. This steadiness creates a sense of safety without explanation. Nothing unexpected will occur. Nothing needs to be processed. The environment created by the narration remains stable, predictable, and unchanging. In this space, thoughts naturally lose their urgency. Memories loosen their grip. The mind no longer needs to arrange or resolve anything. The story does not provide answers or distractions. It provides continuity. As awareness softens further, the distinction between listening and resting becomes less meaningful. The story continues, but it no longer matters whether it is heard. Its presence alone is enough. And so it remains here, steady and quiet, without beginning or ending, without demand or direction, existing only as a calm background to rest, continuing on gently, patiently, and without interruption, allowing sleep to arrive in its own time.